Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Coaster, and welcome to what is so far and probably will hopefully forever be the longest episode of Aerobats of Arabia. In today's episode I'm working on the Moroccan main square, which is yet again a slightly different theme from some of the things that I've built so far, but in my mind is some sort of transition area into what could be the rest of the park. And I really need to stop talking about the rest of the park because, to be very honest, I don't think it's gonna happen. Definitely not the full park. But I still want to continue with these kind of transitional areas to make it seem like this build is part of a full park. And as a part of that, Morocco is, well, partly a theme that I haven't done so far and that I think is just too iconic in the Arabian architecture world to skip. But besides that, it's also a pretty good theme to transition into some European themes, and it's also fun to build, which is not unimportant either. So this is going to be a main square, which connects us to different parts of the Aerobats of Arabia section of the park, and connects these to what could be the main street of the park. And the rest of the main street will also have a sort of Moroccan theme. So this is just going to be one big area with no real rides or anything like that to speak of, mostly just shops and toilets and all that kind of jazz which you'll usually have at a main street in a theme park, in a way that hopefully blends into the other themes. Now, starting off here, I'm building a corner building, and I'm gonna give you guys a bit of a spoiler. This building is not gonna stay in the position where it is right now, and I will, at the midpoint of this episode, try something completely different for this place. So for everything that I'm building here, keep in mind I'm not gonna throw this away. This building is gonna return at some later stage, but it's not gonna stick in this location, just so you know. But I still wanted to show off the building process of this building, because it's pretty fun, and there's some stuff to talk about here. It's also the reason why this episode is so long, because I was thinking for a while to turn it into 2 episodes, but thematically this is just one thing, one big square with all the buildings around it, and I think it works better as an episode to show it off in just one go. And whether that means that you people watching are just gonna watch this in multiple sections or all at once, I have no idea. To be very frank, I still don't have much of an idea of how or why people watch my videos in the first place. But, you know, it's gonna be a long one, so get ready for that. Although I think it's a bit harder on me, these long videos, than they are on the average viewer. Because typically I record most of my videos in one take, and my voice might start giving out at some point. But I've talked enough about that, and I've talked enough about it in all my videos that are long. Let's get to the building and talk a bit about what this building is all about. So, for this style, I wanted to try my hand at Moorish Revival, which is a kind of Western architecture, really. It's like it says on the tin, it's a revival style, which is a style of architecture which was very common in the 19th century in Europe. And there are all kinds of revival styles. Revival on itself doesn't really say much, but there was Gothic revival, which would basically refer to all of the very neo-Gothic churches that were built all over Europe back in the day. There's Renaissance, there's basically every country that had its own sort of architecture at some point had a revival of it in the 19th century. And one of these revival styles is Moorish Revival, which was popular in Europe, but also other places in the world. Funnily enough, more popular in the rest of the world than where the Moorish style of architecture actually originated from, which is Morocco. And Moorish Revival is kind of part of what people like to call Romanticist Orientalism. In the 19th century, Europe was very interested in the architecture and art of all the other cultures in the world, having explored them all and getting a more global trade network and all that jazz, they could finally get inspired by what the rest of the world had to offer. Famously, a lot of European art from back in the day is, for instance, also inspired by Japanese art once they got their hands on it. And Europe started emulating the architecture of different areas in the world as well. I think it was Brighton in the UK, which has a very famous Moorish Revival building. But, you know, there are all kinds of examples of this out there. This building, particularly, which I'm building right here, is inspired by a building in Seville, in Spain, which is a place where Moorish architecture was actually pretty common centuries ago already. Because at some point the Moors, which is a bit of a colonial name for the people who inhabit Morocco and the region, inhabited Spain and left behind a very Moorish architectural heritage. And that goes for Seville as well. So you found a lot of Moorish revival in that city. And one of the examples that I found on the internet, which I found really cool, is a Moorish corner building, which has a round corner with a dome on top of it and loads of detailing and interesting colors. And basically I'm trying to emulate it a little bit with this building. I put a little less color on it, made it blend in a bit more with the environment here. It's also a lot smaller, but some of the elements like the round balcony over there and the dome which I'm adding on top of it are inspired by that building. And what I also find kind of interesting about this Moorish Revival architecture in Europe is that very often you'll find that the composition and the shapes of buildings are somewhat typically European. So this is, you know, it's a kind of Parisian corner building almost. If you just look at the composition, you have a couple of floors, some balconies, it's round right at the corner, and then it has a dome on the corner as well. It's not a very typical shape for a building from Morocco from a few centuries back, which the style is inspired from. It's really just in the detailing and the colors and the use of material that a lot of these revival styles try to bring up the echoes of the past. So that's pretty interesting about it. And this case is also, you have this interesting intermittent dark light brick patterns on a lot of Moorish Revival buildings, which I find pretty fun, and it's nice to add them in Planet Coaster as well, because you very easily can just copy those bricks around and then give them different colors. In general, when it comes to interesting detailing, messing with the colors of items is one of the easiest little tricks in Planet Coaster. So making these bands of bricks with white and black bricks, but also taking a roof or roof tiles and having different colors on it is a pretty easy way to make your buildings look a bit more interesting in Planco, as opposed to having everything exactly the same color. So do try to have a bit of variation with that. Now the dome here has also these brick details, which is based on the building in Seville in Spain. I just made it a little bit more simple and have left a little bit more sandstone texture on it. And that's it for this round corner tower, and by this time we're already 10 minutes into this episode. This was a very time-consuming build to build, just because there are so many little details that I had to circle dome technique around this building. So it turned into a bit of a time-consuming adventure. Same goes for these cornices and details on the wall. They're made out of very small Theme Maker's Toolkit pieces, so it takes a bit of time to put them all in place and actually have it be clean as well. But thankfully, the straight sections of buildings are always easier to do than the curvy sections. And for this straight wall, I'm just going to take the elements that are on the round tower here and copying them over at the same height, turning them into something that we can turn into a straight wall. Anyway, skipping ahead a little bit, I want to show you the building of the archway to the Egyptian alley. Now, if you paid attention in the last episode, you might have already noticed this archway in the background of the alley that I hadn't even shown how I'm building it yet. So here you go. Here you can see me build it. I decided to change the order of these recordings a little bit for this series to make things make sense in terms of what I'm building for the themes, instead of just going with a chronological order, because truth be told, sometimes I just randomly fly through my park whenever I have an idea or I feel like building something, and I don't want to be stuck to just working on a single thing all the time, because that's what fits into the episode recordings. And to be even more frank, I make these videos because I just like playing the game and I like building, but sometimes it's a bit of a hassle to think about, actually finishing my videos. I just rather want to keep on playing, so I wouldn't even say that I'm playing the game just to make these videos, although that does help motivate me. At the same time, I'm really just playing the game because I want to do stuff and showcase that eventually, but recording time lapses is not always right at the front of my mind. Also, I think what's interesting about this archway is that the black and white stones are coming back from the Moorish corner building, but also from the Egyptian side. The arch, I think, makes some sense, because you find these kind of patterns also in old Egyptian cities. At least from my little bit of research looking into old Cairo, I found some textures like this as well. And the same goes for the wall here. Again, coming back to that trick of changing the colors of the stones to give it just a more interesting texture to look at and make everything a little bit less flat. Which in this case I think is especially important, because everything is almost made out of sandstone colors, and I think it would start getting very boring very quickly if I didn't start to at least have a bit of variation in those colors and textures. So there's the gate, and also I'm trying to keep the gate as small and as simple as possible, while at the same time still being realistic for this kind of city gate, because I don't want it to distract from the mosque in the background, which is really the main weenie of this scene. And I also want the arch to be just the right size where you can see the entrance of the mosque, which is really a station building, from the arch when you're standing on that Moroccan main square, but at the same time see the dome of the mosque peek out above the arch, so you still have that weenie effect of, oh, there's a really large fancy building over there, let's head that direction if we want to see it or head to this themed area. And there are all kinds of mini weenies clashing in this park, I think, but the balance is all about trying to preserve the sightlines and thinking of which building can you see from which perspective, and how does it look compared to the buildings that you see in front of it. It's kind of like how in Disney there are many weenies, but usually if they do it well, you don't see the different weenies at the same time from different parts of the park, although some of the Disney castles do mess that up a little bit, which is also one of my critique points for this build. I'm trying to avoid that effect as much as possible, but you'll still find that even in the entirety of Discoveryland in Paris, the rockwork kind of points towards Space Mountain. Even if you're standing in the distance, everything is designed to draw your eye towards that place, which I'm trying to at least incorporate a little bit here in a sort of natural way with this build. Moving on to the next building, and I always say moving on in these cases, whatever. This is inspired by a palace, I believe. I was just looking at palaces, the fancy mansions from the area, and thinking of the interesting, almost kind of classical Mediterranean look of those buildings, and how it's a nice excuse to add interesting details from different pieces in the game. So this is a bit of an experimental building, messing around with different scenery pieces, very small Theme Maker's Toolkit pieces, to make custom windows and just get a slightly different look to this building than some of the other buildings. I don't think I had a very strict, exact inspiration for this, just a general idea of, I want to try one of those kind of revivalist palace or mansion buildings. So that's what this turned into. Also, I'm using Gothic windows, which is thematically very incorrect, but there is a lot of overlap between Moorish architecture and Gothic architecture, so I think in this case it looks okay enough. There are not that many windows that we can choose from in Planet Coaster, so I'm sticking with this for now. Also, this little Theme Maker's Toolkit tile roof piece, it's pretty nice to make custom tile roofs for these sort of mini oriel windows. So that's what I'm doing here. And it has a bit of a blue color because I think I also found that on one of my reference pictures and thought to myself, I never would have thought of making a roof in that color. But you do find that a lot of roofs in Morocco are green or adjacent colors, so I think it makes some sense. And it's fun to mess with something slightly less common as well. Plus, this building is pretty boxy otherwise. It's really just a square, and I try to stay away from building square buildings as much as possible because it's kind of hard to make them look very interesting. Here you can already see me add something to try and make it look a little bit less square. But, you know, since it's a square building, we just have to add a bit more detail to it, I think, to make it look interesting and make use of the sort of symmetrical look that it has. So here we have a larger oriel window sticking out from the front, looking pretty fancy, and adding a bunch of details to make it look like it's supported by wooden support beams, and also working with some stone textures, and then adding some decorations to the roof as well, make it fit in with some of the other buildings. And these are kind of decorated elements, I guess, just playing with some of the things that I've seen in different styles of Moorish Revival architecture, where I feel like these are kind of playing on the idea of battlements, but obviously these are just for decoration purposes, and whoever built this building is probably pretty rich and just using it to show off. And here on the side, I'm just adding some little fancy decorations on the street level as well. Now that'll be it for this building. I'm gonna close this here because it's time to throw away everything that I've done so far. I know, pretty bold decision. But let's start the second time lapse and see why. Welcome back to this episode of Planet Coaster, and we are starting work on the Moroccan main square, right next to the Egyptian alley here. Very nice, it's almost a blank slate, but not quite, because the arch is still there. So, after I finished those buildings, I was looking at the final results and thinking to myself, something just doesn't feel right. And I think, after thinking about it a bit, I found my problem, or at least there were multiple problems with it. For one, I think it was just too attention grabbing, having that corner building with a lot of detail, having that sort of fancy villa-esque building also with a lot of detail, was drawing a lot of attention away from the arch and the station mosque building behind it and the dome, and also kind of clashing with the Moroccan tower that we have on the left here. Altogether, it was just a row of buildings that were all very detailed and all screaming for attention. And very often it's pretty important to try and keep in mind where you want the attention to go and make sure you don't detail everything. And I think this is something that N7 was already talking about in terms of Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 like 10 years ago. At least that's something that lives rent-free in my mind. A quote which goes something along the lines of, if you detail everything, nothing is detailed. You don't really notice where the details are. You don't have the time to actually see them and consider them, and it just becomes one big mess of stuff. And that's the effect that I was getting from this row of buildings, all being very fancy-like. So I decided for that reason that it should be a little bit more simple. And there's another thing that kind of bugged me, which is the fact that the buildings were not just fancy, but also revival architecture, not super authentic. Whereas with the building on the left here, with the tower, but also the station mosque, obviously these buildings are not super authentic. This is still just a theme park, but they are trying to resemble that part of the world. Whereas the domed building, the corner building, was clearly a building in Europe inspired by Moroccan architecture as opposed to a building that could feasibly be in Morocco. And that was kind of my feeling with it. It wasn't really feeling like I could mix these buildings in one shot. So eventually I decided I'm going to need some more simple buildings, some buildings that are more acting as filler. So your eyes can focus on the tower on the left here and the mosque station building in the distance, and just fill in the rest with buildings that fit into the theme but don't draw too much attention to themselves. And that means that I can save the revival buildings and put them on the other side of the square, where, at least in my mind, in my planning of this entire park, we would transition into a European section of the park. So I think it makes more sense to have the buildings there and just keep it simple here. Also, it allowed me to add this little toilet building, which you can see here next to the arch, always handy. I always forget to place toilets in my parks, so here you have it. I didn't forget the toilets, alright? I'm at least a little bit proud of myself, I have to admit this. But yeah, that's basically the story for these moved buildings. Sounds way too dramatic. I'm making it more dramatic than it really is right now. You can just imagine that I stopped recording because I thought to myself, this is going to be one episode. This is going to be fine. This is going to be episode 9. We have the Moroccan Moorish buildings and it's going to be all good. And I was looking at it. I was rotating the camera because I don't know if you all do this as well, but when I'm playing Planet Coaster, most of the time I'm just looking at my park and just rotating my camera and just going around it, and I'm not even sure why I'm rotating it in the first place. I just start rotating around my park, and after a while I think to myself, okay, I'm not going to get any work done anymore. Clearly my brain is not up to the task anymore. Close the game, come back to it at some point later, tomorrow or later this week. That's kind of how it goes. But after a bit of rotating, I just thought to myself, this is not going to be it. We are going to have to cancel this and start over. And that's how we ended up with this episode being the way that it is. But still pretty fun stuff to talk about. And hopefully, at least for those of you who listen to these videos as a sort of podcast style, something fun to consider. Also, this is I'm late to the game when it comes to my recording because I've been talking about other stuff for too much. But making that green roof was pretty fun. Doing this thing with the Theme Maker Toolkit items where there are these roof pieces, and I'm sorry, I forgot who made them, but they have full pieces and then also single pieces, and you can use those single pieces to add some texture to your tiled roof. Just plopping them in here and there and adding some tiles that are lighter or darker than the other ones. And this is huge for realism. If you want realistic tiled roofs, there should be tiles of all sorts of different colors, because once the weathering kicks in, they're all going to look different. And the older a building gets, typically, the more variation you also start seeing in the color and texture of the tiles. So this is pretty awesome and really fun to play with. And I'm also returning to the green roof style here. Now, the buildings that I'm building here now, which I haven't even talked about that much, are inspired by real Moroccan architecture. Whatever real means. I'm not even sure if there is real architecture or whatever fake architecture would be. It's okay, this is a tangent. I'm just gonna keep it very short, but it is interesting that there is this overall notion of real architecture and fake architecture. Whereas, how is architecture in Disney really fake? We often think of it as fake, but at the same time it's still built. It physically exists in the world. How is it any more fake than, for example, revival architecture from the 19th century, when European architects were looking at styles in the rest of the world and copying and emulating it and trying to work it into European styles? It's an interesting thing to think about. What is real and fake architecture? What about retro architecture that is built nowadays that is meant to look like traditional architecture, which traditional architecture people are very much a fan of, but is built with modern materials, and sometimes they add fake wall anchors, for instance. It's a fun question to consider, but yeah, this, at least compared to the revival architecture, I think is a bit more real, because I based it on real locations, specifically the city of Fez, which I've never been to, but I would love to visit at some point, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Old City in Morocco, which just has a very well-preserved old Moroccan city centre with loads of sandstone-coloured buildings and green roofs. And I'm not even exactly sure what the deal is with the green roofs. I tried looking up why roofs in Morocco are often green, especially on buildings like mosques, but I couldn't really find any answer on it, except for just the technical details that they are fired clay tiles, which makes sense, basically like most other roof tiles. But it is very typical, so that's something that I wanted to bring into this here too. And it's cool as well. You don't see green roofs very often, at least not in the Western world. So fun to play with as well. I've played with too many black and orange / red roof tiles at this point. It's fun to bring in a different color. And aside from the green roofs and the sandstone walls, the wood is also coming back a lot in Moroccan architecture. So I'm adding loads of wooden details, Oreo windows, galleries, archways, that sort of thing in this build as well, to try and give it that Moroccan vibe. Also, something interesting about Moroccan architecture is that loads of the times the buildings are sandstone colored because they're built with very cheap and simple and efficient techniques of just ramming earth between wooden restraints. So it's just using local earth and at most in some cases a coating of lime or stucco to protect it and make it more smooth. But the buildings will usually have the colors of the surrounding landscape. So that's also why we see these colors coming back again and again, which is interesting. And I also wanted to add in here. Now this here is where I'm starting work on a building which will once again have some horseshoe arches. So, we're still in Arabia. And there's also the fact that my general philosophy for this square is that I want to have as many buildings with arcades as possible, because that just makes the square look inviting. I think if I just had buildings with straight sandstone walls all the way to the ground floor all around this square, it just would feel very closed, like we just have a path in the middle of a bunch of brownish buildings. And instead having arcades all around it just makes it feel like a much better square. And I think Mediterranean cities know this. They will often do this. Look at many Spanish cities and especially their main squares. They're very often very fancy squares. They'll have arcades running all along the sides, even if there are different types of buildings. It just makes a square more inviting. It means you can make the square a bit smaller and you have lots of shade around it, which, given the climate here, is also pretty important. And that's just the general vibe that I'm going for here. I'm not sure if it's very Moroccan realistic. Probably not, but it's just the sort of thing that felt right to me. So whatever I'm doing with these buildings, I just wanted to make sure that the ground floor for most of the buildings has some kind of arcade or lots of openings that people can get into to go to restaurants or stalls or toilets and all that kind of jazz. And for this building, I thought the best way to do this is to add some horseshoe arches again. If you want to make your thing look Arabian in theme park world, of course, you just want to add some onion domes, but you also want to add some horseshoe arches everywhere. And that's just the key to success. I say slightly sarcastically, but it does work out, and I didn't have any other arches of the type here yet, so I just wanted to add them here. Also, they're pretty fun to build, I think, when it comes to elements like this in general. Of course, there's a bit of annoying work making the arch itself, but then once you've built it and you've made sure you've actually paired a grid piece on it and you've built it on the grid, you can just start copying around like your custom scenery object, and that's always fun to do. And I'm really depending on loads of Theme Maker's Toolkit items here as well. Gladly, I have shared my link in the last episode, so if you're curious about what pieces I am using in my builds, you can check it out in the description of Aerobats of Arabia Part 8. And somewhere in my giant list of my favorite Theme Maker's Toolkit items are all of the items that I'm using in these episodes. So apologies if I don't know them all by name or don't know all of the creators. I tend to want to apologize for that because I am very thankful for all the pieces that people have made and just how much they increase all the things that you can do in the game. But it's not very doable to remember all of it. It's kind of like the in-game pieces, you don't remember those in the first place anyway. Now this building, I am planning to have it be a restaurant at some point in the future. And I say at some point in the future because you all know how much I love doing interiors. Not so much. And I'm probably gonna also procrastinate on doing the interior for this building for quite a while. But for now, I think it makes sense to have this corner building, which is also bordering on the main street and the main square here, have this be a restaurant, because there's just something about theme parks and the corner buildings going in and out of the main streets that there'll always be restaurants, or at least when they go into the park. You know, here we have the corner building where the main street meets the main square, opening up into the park. This is the restaurant building very frequently. You see this in Disneyland, you see it in Phantasialand, you see it in every land. And then you have the corner building on the other side of the main street, which is looking at the entrance, and that's usually the gift shop. The giant gift shop with way too much annoying merchandise that everybody is going through when the park is almost closing. Annoying place to be, I think, most of the time. But also, I totally understand. Oops, I just destroyed my poop. I destroyed my pop filter. I did not just say a dirty word. But it's still here. I almost destroyed it. Hopefully that didn't make too much noise. Sorry about that. But yeah, that's it for corner buildings on main streets, really. I'm not even sure if I'm gonna build one of those big shops. I might have to. Realistically speaking, I probably do. But that's a story for another day. For now, this is going to be my big restaurant building with a shuttered window, which is also pretty interesting because, come think of it, I think I almost always add shutters to windows in this game, but very rarely have the windows shuttered. They'll always be open. That's kind of interesting. Also, adding some foliage here, because foliage makes every building look better. And I was looking at this building thinking, it's a bit too square. It's too many squares. It's a bit too squarey. We have the ground floor. We have the second floor here, but we have everything is just perfectly blocks. It's like it's a Minecraft building. So to unsquare it at least a little bit, just pop in some foliage, and it's slightly better. And add a roof that has a chunky little diagonal piece in it. Not exactly sure how this works, but at least it works to make the building look a little bit more square, a little bit less square. So really, if I say this time and time again, but if you want to get better at making buildings, just make them less square. And if it's looking too square, just add bits and bobs or remove bits and bobs until it starts looking less square, and most of the time it'll look better. And the real cheat code for better looking buildings is adding foliage. If your building sucks, just put foliage in front of it. It's also a bit of a shame if you've built a building that is really good and you do want to add foliage to it, and then once you put a tree in front of it, you're like, you can't see half the detail. That is a bit of a shame. But it does work very well for buildings that you're looking at like, this is bad. Just put a tree in front of it and it just looks like a nice street. That's just how it works. And architects know this, because otherwise they wouldn't add so many trees and bushes in all of their renders, and all of the fancy apartment buildings that are being built wouldn't be marketed with super green, lush, foliage-rich renders by the people who built and developed them to only look like shite when it's actually built in real life. But I'm once again going way off topic. Here you can see me battle with the path system in Planet Coaster. Fun for the whole family. It's great filler to make this video even longer than it already is. But eventually I ended up at a shape which I think is good enough. I do want to add a lot of greenery in this square, because we're supposedly in a pretty hot country, and I think also a square like this looks a lot better with a lot of green space, so there's that. And I'm also adding some sidewalks here, which are a pretty neat texture, I think. It's pretty cool to add a little something like that. And what's a main street without a sidewalk, really? You have to make it seem like it's a real street, even if it's, you know, not really a real street. And also, I'm adding a slightly different sort of pavement piece here in the middle. Don't worry about that. I am not going to make this whole thing just pavement. I'm just trying to work out what shape the green space in the middle is going to have. And I'm going to make up the rest of it with path pieces. Because, of course, the path system in Planet Coaster is not very easy to work with. So if you want custom shapes in your paths, it's usually the best option to try and do that with scenery pieces and hide your real paths underneath it. So that's of course what I'm doing here too. So here's a custom curb with a Theme Maker's Toolkit item that can hopefully turn into a pretty nice planter in the near future, and leaves a lot of space open in the middle where we can put stuff, maybe not quite those umbrellas or parasols I should say, like I just thought of, but at least something to fill this square a little bit, and also make this square open up a bit. So my idea is that when you walk from the main street into the square, the whole thing opens up to the sides, and you see the central weenie of the park in the middle of your field of vision, and everything's just, you know, going to the sides to leave you in awe of the building right in front of you, or something like that. Again, I shouldn't talk about this too much because perhaps it'll never be built, but this is all just leading into my philosophy of how this is all laid out to make it feel like a bigger park. So that's for my simple foliage over there. And then, of course, we start getting into the time where it's time to add the pathworks here. And because this is a different area of the park, I did want to have slightly different pathing as opposed to what we have in the Aerobats of Arabia part. But I was trying to work out, you know, what kind of thing I wanted to go for. You know, slightly different, maybe slightly different textures, slightly different colors. I ended up going for slightly different colors. So it still looks like we're using the colored asphalt like we're using in the rest of the park. Just a slightly different color this time. And to be honest, I just stole this trick from Disney. They do it in many of their parks. I don't think it's the best looking path texture. I kinda rather look at nice brickwork and things like this. But I think it's realistic for this park and Planet Coaster to have this sort of texture. And it also helps to hide the path system in an easy way. It also doesn't turn into weird, unrealistic textures, because in Planet Coaster, if you're trying to make, for instance, a custom brick path and it has curves, your bricks will start curving in weird ways and it'll just be one unrealistic looking mess. And I'd rather settle for something less than ideal in terms of what sort of texture or theme I'm going for, as opposed to trying to make what I want to make, but having to compromise my vision because Planet Coaster is limited. That sounds very pretentious, but that's kind of how it is. So here I'm adding these stairs in front of the square, which once again is one of these things that I just wanted to build to make people walk up to the water, look at the weenie right in front of them, really also make it seem like the weenie is bigger than it really is by having the entire environment move away from you, which is a bit of a forced perspective as well. If there's a building right in front of your weenie, obviously if your weenie has a bit of forced perspective, you can notice that the weenie is a little bit smaller than it probably should be. So making sure that you have an area with nothing around the weenie and having all of your buildings and taller things move away from it should hopefully serve to make it seem a bit bigger when you walk into the park. So that's all just the idea for the way that this area is laid out. Also, maybe at some point in the future, this plaza could be used as a viewing point for a show that could take place on the weenie, like a fireworks show or a drone show, kind of like they do in Disney. And the idea that I'm playing with in my head here is that if this turns into a park and we have different areas, it should be a show that can be seen from all around, and there are different viewing areas in different themed lands to watch the show from. So this would ideally be one of those viewing areas. That just so happens to also be pretty handy in the overall layout of the park, I think, in terms of how you look at everything. So there's that. Also just adding some rock work here below the tower to make that blend in a little bit better with the environment. And finally creating this walkway right next to the water, pretty low, close to the water as well, which is the way that I wanted to finish this element. I was looking at it here straight ahead and realizing that it wasn't entirely symmetrical, which of course it will never be perfect, but at least I think this is good enough, good to settle with. And because a completely straight path didn't quite seem right, it just seemed a bit too boring. But curved also doesn't really work, because then it starts getting, I don't know, kind of weird with the tower. I don't think that would compositionally work out very well. I ended up going for this, which is basically a straight path and a straight part where it goes to the water, and having this one triangular section which juts out, which is a little bit strange, I guess, but I think it just looks best, so that's what I'm going with. As for the wall which I'm placing here, I'm keeping it relatively simple, just a simple stucco wall with some bricks, and again, the heavy lifting is done by the decals here, I think, to give it a bit of texture. Sometimes things are just better kept simple. I was really considering putting fancy pillars here or whatever, but nah, all things considered, walking up to this part, all your attention should be on the weenie in front of you, and this wall should just be there to prevent people from walking straight into the water, and at least give them something to, sit on, or whatever people want to do with it, really. But keeping it simple for thematic purposes, because this is not the thing that the intention should be going to when people are over here. Skipping forward to a slightly more fun part. This is going to be probably my favorite building in this episode. Just something about the way that the detailing worked out kind of surprised me a little bit. And I'm not going to spoil it anymore, but yeah, it's pretty fun. It's kind of Victorian-esque as well. And I was just thinking of, what kind of corner building can we add on this side that has the kind of arcade architecture that I wanted to have on the square, but at the same time a bit more detail than the buildings on the other side. And I found some inspiration in some buildings that I can't find any pictures of anymore, so I wish I could talk about what this was inspired by, but honestly I have no idea. I just know that I was on Google Images one day, checking out and browsing through Moroccan architecture and going from one link to the end to the next, and finding that there were some palace buildings and villas which really took the style to a next level of detail, with very decorated arches, walls with many patterns and motifs, which is of course typical for Arabian architecture, but in a palace sort of style. A little bit like the building that I built in a past episode, where the coasters, Aerobats of Arabia, go into the dark side, the dark ride part, which is also inspired by a palace. So this was my inspiration for this build, and what was originally going to be the ground floor, eventually, I figured, is probably best as the top floor here. So the ground floor instead is going to be a slightly different archway set, a bit more heavy, a bit more sandstone-y, a bit more like simple Gothic pointy arches, and we have the top floor with the fancy lookouts elements, which I imagine this could be some kind of very expensive palace or villa with a beautiful lookout in a park or something like that. In this case, unfortunately, it's just in a main street. But yeah, it's pretty fun. And it's also a relatively easy building to build this way because it's mostly symmetrical, which means that as long as I make sure that everything is aligned to the grid, I can copy this thing around and just finish it by finishing one side and then just, tripling it, if you will, on all the other sides. So that's the technique I'm going for here. This is kind of like a mini weenie, I think, because it's going to be the tallest building of the main square itself here, and I think I can get away with it as well on this side because it doesn't really distract from the tower or the mosque station building. Instead, it's just kind of its own little element of interest on the corner here. That also helps the square feel a little bit more urban, because if all the buildings were a lot lower than this, I think the square would not really feel like you're in the city, and this building kind of gives you a reminder, at least that's how I look at it, of hey, you're still in an urban area. There are some tall buildings around here, there are some fancy buildings here, don't forget where you are. So that's that. So yeah, that's kind of how this works. And again, we have the wooden detailing as well, and the green roof, which comes back in all of the buildings. And I think there's something nice about having the same shade of sandstone walls and the same shade of green tile roof and also the same shade of wood come back in all of these buildings, because it allows me, I think, to just go for a lot of different variations of buildings in heights and shapes, but still keeping a very coherent feeling. Because whenever you're doing, well, a main street in a theme park, or if you're building a city, just a street in general, I think a balance between having the buildings look the same enough, but also different enough to be interesting is pretty important. There's an interesting School of Life video on YouTube that has many views about this topic. And while I don't always agree with the School of Life, nor that video, I think it's very opinion-based and kind of presented as if it were fact, I think there's a lot of truth to at least that core principle which they mentioned there of the balance between variation and consistency in architecture and what makes for attractive cities. But that said, there are some cities with very, very little consistency and some cities with too much of it. Thinking about my personal experience, I went on a road trip through France last week with my family, and we visited Normandy and Brittany, among some other places. And one of the places that we visited was Arras in the north of France, just below Lille. And this town has a really interesting market square and also a smaller market square right next to it with super cool buildings that are originally from the 17th century, very well restored after some damage in the Second World War. But those buildings, as pretty as they are, I think are almost too similar to make for an interesting public space. They almost all have basically exactly the same gable, and their height and colors don't vary very much either. But still, it looks really cool. And I think the sort of unique look that it has is also what gives it its charm. So while I would say there's maybe not enough variety there, it still looks very good. And on the other hand, I think there are some cities on the coast of France, like Honfleur, which have way too much variety in their buildings, if you would look at it in that sense. Some buildings are timber frame, some buildings are stucco, some buildings are just brick, all kinds of different styles all jumbled together. But in the end, it all looks really good. There's just a way in which they all fit together, and I can't really explain it. So I don't think those rules should be too strict anyway, as long as some consideration goes into how much consistency and how much variety you're going for. It's always fun to think about. My consistency in this case, in any case, is in the colors and the materials that I'm using, trying to keep those as much as possible the same. But other than that, in terms of the shapes of the buildings and the elements and details that I'm playing with, it's just kind of balls to the wall, whatever I want to try for any given building. And there's a little bit of variety in different places as well. I'm trying to make sure, for example, that none of the sandstone colored buildings that I'm building have the exact same shade of sandstone. So if you would take your color picker around this park and select different buildings, you get all kinds of different but very close to each other shades of sandstone, which I think is good to at least make the buildings have some variety. Otherwise, it just starts looking a little bit too fake. And even though this is all fake, I don't think you want it looking like it's really fake. So these are the rules, and I think with these basic rules, it's pretty easy and fun to build filler buildings like these as well. Because truth be told, I'm not really putting any thought into this. I'm kind of just Bob Rossing my way through this, placing random walls and random shapes, and then thinking, you know, what kind of details can we add to this? What shape is the next building going to be? There's no real planning, just sticking to my rules of sandstone walls, having slightly different colors for every building, the green little roofs, and wooden details in whichever way they take shape. And using the decals as much as possible. This is still coming back in the Moroccan Main Street here, and honestly, I think I'm never gonna play Planet Coaster anymore without the decals. They're just so good. I know I also keep talking about them, but they're a crucial part of what makes these buildings look the way they do. They kind of make it easier for the eye, I think, to separate one building from another, because if I didn't add the decals on the corners of these buildings here, they would just start blending into each other a little bit too much. So it's a pretty important touch, I think. Also, at this point, I'm also very often copying elements from previous builds, like this Oriel window here, just to save time. I think you won't notice that this element is the same as an element on another side of the park. So, you know, work smart, not hard. Don't try to make everything from scratch, but try to make your own custom objects and copying them around whenever you can to save time. Now it's time for the very last building of this build, or of this video, and I'm gonna speed through this a little bit faster than some of the other time lapses, because I don't think there's much interesting to add that I haven't already talked about in some of the other buildings. If this time lapse is going a little bit too fast, like my voice is right now, do let me know, but I think it's probably gonna be fine. But this is going to be an information building, because I didn't have any of those yet either. And it's just a small guest services thing, because that's also kind of just how Planet Coaster works. Realistically, I think guest information is something closer to the entrance of your park, and a bigger building, a place that you can actually walk into and have different desks and maybe some park maps and maybe also your first aid, lots of combinations with other things that a park just needs to do. In this case, I think this is my main place for people to just get general information or pick up a park map real quick or something like that. This is the main square after all, so still a pretty important place. And also we're putting a little info sign here. Speaking of signage, this main street doesn't even have any signage yet, so that's something that I should definitely play around with in the future a little bit, because it's something I sometimes feel I don't do enough. Same goes for clutter, although I do clutter a lot of foliage in my parks. I always have to remind myself, like, this is not just about the buildings, it's also about putting signage and stuff on it that makes it look like there's actually life, and they're not just buildings on their own. But that's just my struggle to deal with in life. I sometimes really love doing buildings, and then when it comes to adding clutter and things like that, I'm just too excited about moving on to the next building. These are the kinds of things that happen. Also, this building is a very reddish tint compared to some of the other buildings in the build. Kind of experimenting with that a little bit here. Feels very risky, but I think it kind of works. And I'm kidding here, it's just a very simple building. Also, I'm adding something on the side here to make it look like we have multiple buildings here and make it look like a real cityscape, but in reality this is all just the same small building. Also, I'm keeping in mind that these buildings should be filler, because there are going to be fancier buildings and weenies at this side of the park whenever that does happen, and if it does, so keeping it pretty simple for that reason. And finally, with a bit of clutter and a bit of pathwork all around it, that is the final touch for the Moroccan main plaza. I hope you guys liked watching this episode and managed to stick with me for the pretty long ride, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching, bye bye.